Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We are very excited to be talking about preservation in the Adirondacks today. But before we get into it, I wanted to give a brief intro. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you have found your way to this webinar but don't know who the League is, we are a New York statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. The League works all over New York State, and we do that through lots of different kinds of programs. We offer technical services, grants, our 7 to Save list of endangered historic sites. We do public policy and advocacy work at the local, state, and federal level. We have our Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards and a variety of online programming, from a monthly book club to historic tax credit workshops and webinars like the one that you are tuning into today. So we're excited to be talking about preservation in the Adirondacks, and we are actually doing a spotlight on the Adirondacks all this month. Last week, we hosted a book talk with Brad Edmondson about his book, A Wild Idea, which you can find the recording of on our YouTube channel. I will drop that in the chat shortly. And later on this month, we'll be doing some video tours of various sites that the League has been involved in over the years, which we're pretty excited about. But today it's all about preservation in the Adirondacks and how the preservation movement has kind of shaped the region, how it continues to evolve. And the Adirondacks is such an interesting area of New York State, and so we're excited to have some experts here to talk about that. We'll be joined today by Amy Catania, the Executive Director of Historic Saranac Lake, Steven Engelhart, the Executive Director of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, Howie Kirschenbaum, who recently released memoir Coming of Age in the Baby Boom, in which he talks about his efforts to save Great Camp Sagamore, which the League was very involved in way back when, so he's going to be talking about that. And then the conversation at the end will be moderated by Anne Van Ingen, who is Chairman of the Board of the Adirondack Experience, the Museum on Blue Mountain Lake. She's also president of the St. Regis Foundation, which is a land trust in the Adirondacks. And she was a former chair of the League's board as well. So we're really excited that she's going to be kind of driving the conversation today. A couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions during anyone's presentation or during the group discussion at the end, please drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to incorporate as many audience questions as possible during that group conversation. General comments you can drop in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, so I'll drop pertinent links there in case anybody is curious. And just to make note that this webinar is being recorded, it is streaming live on our Facebook page, and the recording will also be up on our YouTube channel after we are done here today. So if you can't stay for the thing, you will be able to find the recording. And so before we hand it off to our panelists, I want to welcome Anne to the screen. She's kind of going to give an overview of how today's presentation is going to go, and I'll leave it with her. Thank you all so much.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. This is a real pleasure to be here today. I am delighted to be talking about my favorite topic, which is historic preservation in the Adirondacks. And really happy to be here with 3 longtime preservation Adirondack colleagues. This is a pleasure for me, and I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be terrific fun. So I just wanted to take a moment to just sort of set the context for today so you understand the flow of the conversation. And I think it's useful to think about the preservation movement, which at its best creates an ecosystem. So a network of people, of individuals, and of organizations all working towards the same goal, which is preserving our past for the future. So that's absolutely what happens in the Adirondacks, and it has happened for many decades now. There is an ecosystem there that's very successful. So we're going to look at that ecosystem today, and we're going to look at the larger state and regional level, and then we're going to, sorry, there's a question in the chat, which I'm sure Katie will work on. And then we're also going to look at the local preservation happening at the more local municipal level, at more granular level, so you can get a sense of how this work happens around the region. So we're going to start with Howie Kirschenbaum, who many of you know. He's going to speak as an individual, as a person who makes projects happen, but he also is going to tell the tale of Great Camp Sagamore, which played a major role in, frankly, the creation of the Preservation League of New York State. That project actually launched the League and put it on the map as a force to be reckoned with statewide. And Howie will tell you how that happened. But he and that project had an important statewide impact on how preservation happens in the state of New York. So then we're going to go to Amy Catania, who, as you know, is Executive Director of Historic Saranac Lake, and she will talk about projects on the local level that she's been involved in over many years. Then on to Steven Engelhart, who has run Adirondack Architectural Heritage for 27 years, as you all know, and he'll be talking about the challenges and opportunities of doing preservation at the regional level. So you're going to hear about many different ways that preservation happens and how inspiring it can be when the ecosystem works, when things get done, because there's a network of people and organizations working together. And it's a pleasure to be part of that. So each of the speakers, again, as Katie said, will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, present their projects, and then we'll open it up for conversation for the last half hour, during which I hope to be able to get to as many of your questions as possible. So do put them in the chat function and let's go. So we're going to turn it over now to Howie.
Well, thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here, to be working with the Preservation League again. First time I did that was 45 years ago or so, when a major portion of the historic site Sagamore, sometimes called Great Camp Sagamore these days, was endangered. The New York State wanted to purchase the 1,500 acres around Sagamore for the State Forest Preserve. And at the last minute, the Preservation League intervened and convinced them to sell 7 acres with the main buildings at Sagamore to a nonprofit organization. I was the executive director or co-executive director of that organization at the time, and we were able to purchase Sagamore for our educational programs. But almost immediately we realized what a problem it was that the caretaking complex at Sagamore didn't come along with the sale, because by remaining on state land in the Forever Wild Forest Preserve, these 11 buildings, including large barns and staff housing and workshops, would have to be torn down because the state constitution requires that when the state owns property and buildings in the forest preserve, under most circumstances, they need to be removed. So after several attempts, we realized that the only way we were going to save the caretaking complex at Sagamore, and we realized that was increasingly important, because the more we learned about this great camp style of architecture, the more we realized that the place where the workers lived and worked were equally important as where the main family, the owning family, lived and enjoyed themselves. So to have half a great camp was not to have a great camp at all. And therefore, we realized we would have to amend the Constitution of New York State to provide an exception for the Sagamore buildings. And the exception would be a land exchange, whereby Sagamore Institute would trade over 200 acres of land to New York State for the Forest Preserve in return for receiving 10 acres with the caretaking buildings. So to undertake that amendment, which I drafted based on previous precedents, we needed to put together an alliance. And that alliance included 2 major environmental organizations, the Adirondack Council and the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. It included a key leader at Department of Environmental Conservation, and it included the Preservation League of New York State. So here's where I'm going to, for the next 13 minutes, read from some excerpts from my memoir to tell that story. And it was quite a dramatic story. And Diana Waite, at that time, was the executive director of the Preservation League of New York State. And as Anne said, they had helped save the main part of Sagamore several years earlier, and had monitored our preservation and restoration work at Sagamore ever since. The Preservation League was justifiably proud of the role that they had in saving Sagamore earlier, and were pleased with our work in utilizing and caring for the property. They were our most obvious ally, and they took the most active role in the coalition to support Sagamore. Diana Waite and I visited Democratic Assemblyman Maurice Hinchey, head of the Environmental Conservation Committee, who introduced the legislation in the State Assembly. Now, the way you change the Constitution of New York State was to pass your legislation, your proposal in the state assembly and Senate, and then after the next election, the next assembly and Senate would have to pass the same resolution, and then it would go before all the voters of New York State as a public referendum. So Maurice Hinchey, the head of the Environmental Committee, not only introduced our legislation, but he asked his counterpart in the state Senate, Republican John Dunn, to introduce it in his committee. At first, Dunn agreed, but then he became reluctant to introduce the legislation and was not saying why. Without Dunn's support, our campaign would be over before it had barely begun. Then luck played a part. Warren Anderson, the Republican majority leader of the state Senate, and Mrs. Anderson previously had signed up for an upcoming ski weekend at Sagamore. I happened to be in the office the day he personally called to cancel and to request his deposit back. Ironically, he was petitioning Sagamore for a favor, as technically he was not entitled to a refund. Of course, his deposit would be cheerfully refunded, I said. And might I take a moment to explain how the future of one of New York State's most important cultural and historical resources rested in his hands? Within days, Senator Dunn introduced the bill and shortly thereafter reported it out of his committee. We got lucky again in the assembly when our bill came before the powerful Ways and Means Committee, chaired by Democratic Jerome Kramer. Bills often died in this committee. It so happened that Kramer came from Long Beach, my hometown, where my cousin Jerry was the Democratic Party leader. Kramer lived 2 doors down from my friend Rob Ehrenreich. I practically played in Kramer's yard throughout much of my childhood. My father and he exchanged greetings when they happened to meet on the Long Island Railroad commuting to New York City. He knew of me and remembered my civil rights activities in Mississippi. None of this meant Kramer would stick his neck out or support a bill he did not believe in, but it helped get his attention. The legislation was reported out and it passed the Ways and Means and Tourism Committee, and with no objection from the governor's office, came to a floor vote where it passed unanimously. But something was wrong in the Senate again. Senator Barkley would not report the bill out of his Judiciary Committee. Several phone calls to his office produced no satisfactory explanation or return calls from the senator. This was a serious stumbling block. With only 5 weeks left in the session, the bill could easily die right there on Senator Barkley's desk. The senator was not responding to our appeals, so I thought he might pay more attention to his own constituents. So I went to Sagamore's mailing list and found the names of 20 or so people who lived in the senator's district in the Oswego area. I just contacted them and urged them to write or call the senator and express their concern over the Sagamore legislation. Shortly thereafter, the senator took my phone call and explained the problem. It was not enough to have the support of our own Senator Farley, which we did, he explained. The Republicans in the Senate take their lead on Adirondack legislation from Ronald Stafford. When Barkley had called Stafford, Stafford said he didn't know anything about the matter, and that was that. Barkley did nothing and did not intend to do anything without Stafford's approval. He candidly revealed that the only reason he even bothered to talk with me was that, to his amazement, several of his constituents seemed to have some strong feelings on the issue. He suggested I talk with Senator Stafford. I reached Senator Stafford's assistant, Phil Fina, and ate my share of humble pie. Please forgive me. We were new at this. We had no intention of slighting the senator. We're only some nice folks trying to save some historic buildings in the senator's region. The senator's support is desperately needed. Senator Stafford's aide was perfectly helpful. He was glad I called. Could I please send him all the information on the legislation? The senator just needed to understand what was happening. Assuming all was as I described it, he was sure there would be no problem with the senator's support. There was not. Within a week, Senator Barkley had reported the bill out of his committee. Senator Anderson allowed it to come to the floor, and it passed with only one dissenting vote. So after passing this first session of the legislature, we then, the following year, had to go through the whole process again And again, it passed successfully through the legislature with different hiccups and obstacles that we managed to overcome, and passed virtually unanimously. Now it would come before the voters of New York State at the November election. Most worrisome to me was that we cannot be sure how the measure would actually be worded on the ballot on election day. When the legislation was condensed into a short proposition that would fit on the ballot, key elements of the proposal might be dropped or distorted. That problem alone could defeat the amendment unless enough voters were educated beforehand to understand the proposition. The Preservation League felt so strongly that we cannot rest on our laurels that they took major responsibility for launching and financing a statewide coalition to save Camp Sagamore. They also recognized the potential of this issue to help achieve their own mission, to educate individuals and groups around New York State about the importance of historic preservation. This was the first time in New York State history that a historic preservation proposal had appeared on the statewide ballot, and they were going to make the most of it. Involving their board of directors, hundreds of members of organizations around the state, and thousands of individual members, they developed an impressive coalition to speak out and work for passage of Proposal 6, the Sagamore Land Exchange. Similarly, I was able to enlist many environmental and Adirondack organizations in the cause. Eventually, the coalition to save Camp Sagamore included New York's U.S. Senators Moynihan and D'Amato among its honorary co-chairs, individual supporters that included Governor Mario Cuomo, numerous state legislators, major business and civic leaders and entertainment personalities, and scores of historic preservation organizations, environmental groups, sporting associations, chambers of commerce, and other organizations. Together, the Preservation League and Sagamore Institute distributed voluminous materials in support of the land exchange. I wrote one flyer and had 100,000 copies printed showing Sagamore's impressive main lodge, followed by Save Sagamore, Vote Yes on Proposal 6, with short, hard-hitting supporting arguments. The League produced larger posters with the same text and a list of all the institutional and individual members of the coalition. We printed 2,000 bumper stickers and 50,000 small round stickers that looked something like a campaign button, with the Sagamore Main Lodge in the center and the usual words, Save Sagamore, Vote Yes on Proposal 6, written around the perimeter. My colleague, Elliot, knew I had just flown through Albany one day when he saw Save Sagamore stickers on every public phone booth in the airport. We also prepared a longer 6-page fact sheet that provided more detailed information for those who needed it. All these items, photographs, and articles on Sagamore's history and architecture were combined into press packets that were sent to newspapers and radio and TV stations across the state. The Preservation League sponsored a press junket bus trip to Sagamore from Albany, and some of the legislators who had supported the amendment held a press conference at Sagamore. All the major city newspapers, including the New York Times, wrote editorials endorsing Proposal 6. I was interviewed by several radio and TV stations and spoke to groups and fundraising parties across the state. The Preservation League had a booth at the annual state fair in Syracuse, where we passed our literature out and talked to thousands of voters. At about this time, I read Robert Caro's recently published first volume of The Life of Lyndon Johnson. His portrait of Lyndon Johnson's rise to power in Texas was a fascinating portrait of state politics in action. If there was a single theme that Caro emphasized, it was LBJ's political style of doing absolutely everything possible to accomplish his goals. The man left no stone unturned. Every constituent's letter was answered, apparently personally. If a constituent's son or daughter won a prize, the family received a congratulatory note from their congressman. If a reporter wrote an article about LBJ, he got a call or letter thanking him. If a constituent had a problem, no matter how inappropriate for a congressman's attention, LBJ's office personally tried to help. Even when his aides were confident they had 75% of the state legislature lined up for a vote, needing a simple majority, Johnson would tell his aides to work on the other 25%. And while they were at it, call the other 75% again, just to be sure. He lived by the premise that you can't do enough. The only election he ever lost, his first bid for the US Senate, was when he violated his own advice, relaxed on the day before the election, and lost by a handful of votes. I knew I would hate to live my life this way, but this was probably my first and last hurrah in state politics, so I thought. And I was impressed by LIBJ's example. I called the Preservation League and suggested we see what we could do to influence the wording of the amendment on the ballot. Actually, this important decision is made by a bureaucrat in Albany. He or she gets the full wording of the legislation along with a recommendation from the Attorney General as to which elements in the bill are the key ones. I felt it was essential that the phrases historic preservation, a nonprofit educational organization, and of equal or greater value be included in the proposal before the voters. Just days before the ballot was finalized, we tracked down the individuals in the Attorney General's and Secretary of State's office who would be recommending and deciding upon the wording. Diana Waite and I each placed a phone call and spoke with them, conveying our perspective that these phrases on the ballot were essential if the voters were to understand the proposal. Of course, they explained they could not be influenced by any special interest in their choice of wording. Nevertheless, I have good reason to believe that at the very least, the words "for the purposes of historic preservation" were included in the ballot language as a result of our last-minute calls. LBJ's political philosophy of leaving no stone unturned served us well. This was an off-year election and voter turnout was expected to be low. On the other hand, there were 8 proposals on the ballot that year, an unusually high number in New York, including a controversial multi-billion-dollar highway and bridges bond issue for which Governor Cuomo was campaigning vigorously. We worried that many voters would go to the polls just to vote down this spending proposal, and the negative momentum would spill over to Proposal 6. The pros were saying that our chances were fair, but it was too close to call. On Election Day, November 6, 1983, I was in Georgia conducting a drug abuse prevention workshop for the Georgia Department of Mental Health. I had already voted by absentee ballot. Late that night, Elliot called me from Sagamore with the results. The Sagamore Land Exchange had passed with 62% of the votes cast. With over 1,550,000 votes in favor, Proposal 6 fared better than any of the 8 proposals on the statewide ballot. The highway and bridges bond issue had passed by the slightest margin. To our additional satisfaction, the measure carried by at least as strong a margin within the Adirondacks, which had a long history of voting down any proposal the state supports. And in the Saranac Lake election district, the news was best of all, with 79 votes in favor and only 3 against. In a small community where everyone knows each other's business and it's easy to make enemies, that was an extraordinary vote of confidence. To show our appreciation, we invited all 80 or so year-round adult residents to a victory celebration dinner, and 60 of them turned out for the party. Among the revelers were men and women who had worked at Sagamore for years themselves, or whose parents and grandparents had built, lived at, or worked at Sagamore. Sagamore was an important part of their family and community history. There was a delightful irony in the occasion, Racket Lakers being served dinner in the Vanderbilt's dining room, the people of New York State joining together to support the preservation of 11 caretaking buildings. Was I being naive? Or was this how the system was supposed to work? Was I inside or outside the establishment now? We're going to come back at the end of our session today to a reprise where we're engaged in a similar campaign 40 years later to do a land exchange to save another major great camp of the Adirondacks. But this is where it started. This is where the Preservation League started. And it looks like history may be repeating itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Howie. That was a great taste of your book, and I'm so excited to read it. I have to say I haven't read it yet, but it is on my list, and now I think that moves it up a little bit. So I look forward to it, and I'm sure many of us do as well. I'm Amy Catania, Executive Director of Historic Saranac Lake, and I'm here to talk a little bit about Saranac Lake, Historic Saranac Lake as a model of architectural preservation on the local level. I have to say quickly, Howie, as I was looking at your book, I saw two things about you that make me just very excited to read your book. One is the mention of Carl Rogers, and he is my husband as an educator and counselor. Carl Rogers is a hero of my husband, Roger, and also your connection to University of Rochester, where I am about to send my youngest son off to college. So we're kindred spirits in a couple of ways. So Historic Saranac Lake, let me see if I can share my screen here. Hold on a second. I'm going to show just a few slides. And what I'd like to do is give a little overview of Saranac Lake history, talk a bit about the origins of Historic Saranac Lake, and then talk about how we've developed to become a model of preservation on the local level. Historic Saranac Lake was founded in 1980 as an architectural preservation organization. We make our home here in the Saranac Laboratory Museum. This was built in 1894 as the first commercial laboratory for the study of tuberculosis. Our mission is to preserve and present area history and architecture to build a stronger community. So Saranac Lake's history as a health resort is reflected in our built environment. The Trudeau Sanatorium was founded in 1884, 10 years before our laboratory was built by Dr. Trudeau. He founded his sanatorium just up the road from here. It was the first successful sanatorium in the country for the treatment of tuberculosis, and tens of thousands of people from around the world flocked to Saranac Lake for Dr. Trudeau's fresh air treatment for TB. So patients stayed at the Trudeau Sanatorium, but they also stayed at other large sanatoria that sprouted up in the area, and they stayed in private homes that catered to patients, also known as cure cottages. One of Historic Saranac Lake's early projects was to do a survey of the cure cottages of Saranac Lake, and over 900 cure cottages were identified in that survey, and many of them were nominated to the National Register. Cure cottages come in all shapes and sizes, but the prominent feature of a cure cottage is a cure porch, and that's where the patients were sitting out to breathe the fresh air and even sleeping out year-round. So Saranac Lake's downtown commercial blocks stand as a testament to the booming tuberculosis years. The size and quality of the downtown buildings are startling for a town of 5,000 people surrounded by 6 million acres of mostly forest. In the 1950s, the antibiotic treatment for tuberculosis was perfected, and this spelled the rapid decline of Saranac Lake's economy. One by one, the cure cottages and businesses closed, and things fell on hard times. Unfortunate renovations began to occur. Renovations like this one on Main Street started happening. This is still a sad testament to the importance of preservation downtown today. And Historic Saranac Lake's roots date back to this kind of thing that was occurring. There was a committee that formed in the village in the late 1970s to study the possibility of more downtown renovation. And luckily, some people joined that committee, like HSL's founder, Mary Hotaling, and other historians and preservationists that were on that committee. They raised the alarm bell that our built environment deserved protecting and that it was key to the identity of the village. This committee of women was the beginning of Historic Saranac Lake. One of Historic Saranac Lake's first tasks was to nominate properties to the National Register. This led to extensive documentation of the history of the village and the architecture of the village. Over 170 properties were nominated to the register, and we are now up to over 230 properties listed either individually or as parts of districts. Through this work, personal connections were forged and history was uncovered and documented. In the mid-1990s, Historic Saranac Lake undertook two preservation projects. We worked to rehabilitate the Bartok cabin where the great composer spent the last summer of his life and to document the history of his time there. And we continue to preserve and interpret that site today, although we don't own it, it's privately owned. And HSL also led the restoration of Union Depot, built in 1904. Then, about 20 years ago, we acquired this building and began the process of its restoration, opening it as a museum in 2009. Operating a museum presented challenges to us as an architectural preservation organization. It's a lot of work to serve two missions. Museums, like architectural preservation organizations, require a certain kind of expertise, and that causes stress in terms of staffing and funding. Luckily for us, there are amazing individuals locally, like Mary Hotelling and her husband Jim, and other founders of historic Saranac Lake who are still really involved with the organization. So we have that expertise. And we also have partners in preservation like Howie Kirschenbaum, carrying the flag of preservation and accomplishing so much in the region. Our partners in the region at Adirondack Architectural Heritage provide invaluable advice and support on advocacy issues, preservation practices, and more. And the Preservation League provides that same kind of support for us as our state partner. We're also very lucky in New York to have the New York State Council on the Arts, their support for preservation, design, and museums. So it can be daunting to have the preservation and museum mission, but there are many benefits. Opening a public-facing museum allows us to build alliances across the community, and it provides many means of public education. One of our main ways that we do that is through the Cure Porch on Wheels. This is a project that we developed in recent years. It's a mobile model of a Cure Porch, and it's something that we bring throughout the region to different events and different communities in the area to build awareness about the architecture and the history of the Cure Cottage. It also serves as a place where we capture history of other stories of the region. So for example, we brought it down to the ice fishing derby at Lake Colby one winter and recorded stories of ice fishermen in the area. So it also serves as an oral history booth for us. Another important part of our education and outreach is the Wiki website. This is a project that really grew organically out of volunteer efforts. It's grown to become a website of local history and architecture. It's over 6,000 pages. It just continues to grow, and it's really like an online encyclopedia that documents our history, and it's something that just sort of serves as an incredible resource for all of us to understand our community better. And here's a photo from last week. I just wanted to include, this is our wonderful student intern for this summer, Sydney, who helped develop a flyer about the Helen Hill National Register District, about the National Register and the tax credit. And we took the flyers door to door and explained to the neighbors in Helen Hill the benefits of the program. So it's those kinds of outreach programs that really are so important. So looking back, it's clear that preservation happens slowly, one step at a time. I sat down with Mary Hotelling earlier in the week just to pick her brain a little bit about the early founding of historic Saranac Lake. And it's so interesting to look back over the past 40, however many years, and see how, things happen in small steps, and it builds on itself. One tour, one conversation at a time, one brochure that is researched and written at a time. You build awareness, interest, partnerships, and capacity. And eventually, sometimes the right conditions and people converge and good things happen. In recent years, good things have been happening in Saranac Lake. The preservation and reopening of the historic Hotel Saranac was huge for the community. This hotel, built in the 1920s, had fallen on hard times and had closed. And it was really casting an enormous shadow over the future of downtown and the village. Luckily, the history of the building had been preserved quite well. The right people came together at the right time, and a lot of people in the village worked on making this happen. But people with roots in Saranac Lake's history and the tuberculosis history purchased the building and restored it. And it's really just made an enormous difference for all of us. The other thing that happened the next year, whoops, sorry, I went too quickly, hold on. There we go. So the other thing that happened in 2019 then was that the Village of Saranac Lake won the Downtown Revitalization Initiative Award from the state of New York. That brought $10 million into the downtown for revitalization and preservation projects, and historic Saranac Lake was one of the beneficiaries of that award. And so when we talk about preservation success stories and exciting things happening, for us, this is a project that we're really excited about, the rehabilitation and expand of the Trudeau building for expansion of our museum. This was the home and medical office of Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau. It's next door to our laboratory, and it's right next door to the Hotel Saranac downtown. In 2019, we purchased this building, built in the same year as the lab and originally part of the same deed. The project will create a 2-building museum campus for historic Saranac Lake downtown that interprets the rich history of the Saranac Lake region. It really provides the space for us to be able to expand the interpretation at our museum, to talk about a broader geography, not just the village of Saranac Lake, but the Saranac Lake area, and also to really bring in stories that of the region before tuberculosis and after tuberculosis. TB is a big part of our history, but it's not the only piece, and it's important to us to tell that broader story. So for this project, we've raised over $2.2 million to date, about $1 million in state grants and over $1 million in private support and foundation support. We're also seeking to utilize historic preservation tax credits to help finance the project. We're really excited about this. As you may know, New York State recently increased the state tax credit to 30% for projects under $2.5 million, which is a really exciting way to make the tax credit more usable for smaller projects. So we're now speaking with area banks and other private investors about partnering to utilize the tax credits. This will bring financing of about over $700,000 into the project to make it possible to just get it all done at once. We're very excited to demonstrate successful use of the tax credits by a nonprofit organization. And we think this will be a model that can be replicated in rural areas and small communities across the state. So, looking back on our development as a museum and architectural preservation organization, it's interesting to see that this project is really a natural outgrowth of both of our missions. Without our museum focus, I don't think we would have seen the possibilities in this building for reuse. And without our preservation focus, we wouldn't have seen both the urgency of preserving the building, and we wouldn't have understood how to go about it in terms of how to treat the building properly, and also how to pursue the historic preservation tax credit and other possible sources. So I'd like to close by inviting you all to come visit the museum. The building down below, the laboratory, is open year-round, 5 days a week with museum exhibits, and soon we will be expanded to incorporate exhibits into the building above as well. And I'd like to leave you with this thought. Museums are natural partners in preservation. The staff at history museums and historical societies often don't have a background in preservation, but I think with some education, museums are natural places to advance the goals of preservation. Preservation-minded history museums like historic Saranac Lake can serve as models for preservation on the local level. So thank you for listening to that, and I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I can find my cursor. Hold on one sec. There we go. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Steven.
Thank you, Amy. And just want to say it's been an incredible pleasure working with you over a decade or so in various ways in Saranac Lake and beyond, some of which we may touch on a little bit later. So I'm Steven Engelhart. I'm the Executive Director of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, which is the regional nonprofit organization for the Adirondack region. And this year we're celebrating our 30th anniversary. And so this has been a great opportunity to kind of reflect on a lot of that. Let me just see here. I seem to have lost my screen. Just hold on. I'm not sure what's going on. I'm not seeing my screen anymore.
There we go.
Hold on, just almost there. So I think that's working now. Yeah, so let me start by giving a little bit of context to the organization's work that goes back to our founding 30 years ago. And Anne Van Ingen in the introduction talked about a book session that you had last week at the League around Brad Edmondson's new book, A Wild Idea. And I think the reason that this is important to our work is that 50 years ago when the Adirondack Park Agency was created, among other things, it created a real hostility to land use planning in the region. And so land use planning and the use of regulatory mechanisms is a tool that a lot of historic preservation organizations use, but it was really not a tool available to us in part because of a lot of local attitudes around land use planning and regulation. The other thing that's true about our region is that there's a lot of state land, and there's as we found out going forward, there's a fair number of historic resources within the state land, and this often created conflicts between our interests as preservationists and the interest of environmentalists. So these are sort of essentially the 5 pillars of our work. And I think the biggest of all of these, well, the biggest 2 are public education and advocacy. Actually, they're all pretty big. But one of the reasons that we focused so heavily on public education for the last 30 years is because we really saw that we were in this for the long haul. What we really wanted to do is to develop a preservation ethic in the region that was really well entrenched. And we realized the only way to really do that was by educating people. And so one other thing before I get into education, I just thought I would list a couple of the things that I think are attributes of our work, which you'll see me mention as I go through the remainder of the slides, about being inclusive and being accessible as an organization, and being nimble and being able to shift directions if we needed to be persistent, to be able to pursue things over a long period of time, to be willing to roll up our sleeves and do the work, to have a big set of tools available to us and the people that we worked with, and to follow our curiosity. So, you know, as I said, a big part of our work has been public education, and this has included you know, hundreds of day-long tours, hundreds of lectures, publications, conferences, workshops, other kinds of written materials that have really been at the basis of our work. One of the things that we realized very early on was that the Adirondacks was really well known for the kind of rustic architecture that you see here at Camp Pine Knot on Racket Lake. And it was great that the region had this kind of architecture to celebrate, but we realized that there was a lot of other architecture worth our attention. This is a British fort at Crown Point. And so very early on, we developed a lecture program called There's More to Adirondack Architecture in Great Camps. And this wish to kind of get people to see the importance of the region's architecture in the broadest possible terms became really central to everything that we did. in our educational work and in our advocacy work and the technical assistance work that we did. And it got so that it just was hardly a thing that we didn't care about, whether it was the home of a miner in Lion Mountain or the barn at Nettle Farm or other things that we'll see here. We really wanted to remind people that the simple, the vernacular, the more everyday buildings that are prominent in most communities were also worthy of our attention and preservation. And you know, part of our curious nature led us to explore areas and stories that had never been explored before, including one of our recent favorites, really discovering the work of this man named Isaac Johnson, who was an escaped slave that came to the North Country and became a mason and a builder and even an architect, and searching out his work and bringing that and shining a light on that. We've also always been interested in how people made a living. What were the economic engines of various communities, as shown here at a wonderful blast furnace at Tawas in the town of Newcomb. We've used our educational work sort of paired with our advocacy work to one of the kind of building types that we're very worried about are the number of historic bridges that exist in the region. And so we've done educational programs around historic bridges. Our interests are really all over the place, including a lot of late 20th century stuff like the Tiki Motel here in Lake George, or this Atlas missile silo, which was one of about 12 that circled the Air Force Base in Plattsburgh. And, you know, the quirkier, the better for us. This is a garage in Port Henry that was built as a combination auto dealership and car garage and horse carriage facility. But as we explored this building much deeper, we realized it also embodied the life and the aspirations of a young serviceman who went off to fight in Vietnam and didn't come back. Again, this whole way of using architecture to tell stories has been very central to our work. We also like to use architecture to sometimes tell stories that are uncomfortable, like the fact that there's a huge prison system in the Adirondacks, and that this is part of the economic engine of the region. And so, for instance, for 25 years, we took people inside the maximum security prison at Dannemora, and among other things, sat down every time with a group of inmates to talk about their lives and what it was like to be incarcerated there. We've also reminded people about how the connection between sustainability and historic preservation is in a variety of ways. We've also published a number of books about preservation in the region, all part of this basket of educational programs that's so central to our work. We were also founded 30 years ago around the issue of the preservation of Camp Santinoni. This was another early project that the Preservation League was very much a partner in. We spent about 10 years advocating on its behalf, finally convincing New York State to preserve it and finding a legal mechanism to do it within the State Forest Preserve. And since then, we've done about $3 million worth of work and staffed it in the summer. And it's been a wonderful regional destination for thousands of people every year. Similarly, very early on, we took up the cause of the preservation of Adirondack fire towers. I think Howie was at the very first meeting in Blue Mountain Lake around the preservation of that fire tower. Here again, there were conflicts between a historic structure and their forest preserve setting. And we had to find a way, and we did, for the most part, to make their preservation and public use legal. Another one of, I think, our great successes. We also took up the cause of the preservation of the Bow Bridge over the Sacondaga River in Hadley, another project that we did in cooperation with the Preservation League, which provided some of the planning study money to make this project happen. I talked earlier about some of the things that we've always been willing to do as an organization, and one is to roll up our sleeves and do the work. And in this case, we offered to write a federal grant application on behalf of Saratoga County that resulted in a $1.2 million grant to the county, which they matched with the money they were going to use to demolish the bridge and rehabilitated it. And here you can see opening it to great fanfare. And I think J.D. Lorenzo is there behind the podium. We've also had advocacy successes in saving a really wonderful barracks building in Plattsburgh that was part of the Army barracks there. It's now a brewery and a restaurant. But again, here we actually were part of forming a separate Friends organization for the old stone barracks to make that possible. Another advocacy success was the restoration of the town hall in Westport, which we did with the town of Westport and other local volunteers. And again, I said earlier about being inclusive, and so even the smallest things sometimes get our attention. This is a little fruit and vegetable stand that was about to be demolished. We saw that it had some architectural value, that it told us a nice, simple story, and we convinced the Adirondack Museum, the Adirondack Experience, to take it and to put it in their collection, which we did. Not all of these advocacy efforts have been successful. In fact, there's been quite a few major losses. The League was a partner with us in trying to save the 1929 Lake Champlain Bridge between Crown Point, New York and Chimney Point, Vermont, a battle that we ultimately lost. But look on the lower right at what it's been replaced with. 45 years from now, this bridge, I'm sure, will be placed on the National Register. It's a lovely piece of engineering, and sometimes you lose these battles and you do just have to move on. We also lost the battle to save a hunting and fishing club in a very kind of humble set of buildings, the land of which had been acquired by New York State and put in the Forest Preserve. And despite our best efforts, we were not able to convince the state that there was a public purpose for the preservation of these really wonderful buildings. We also lost a long battle to try to preserve the railroad corridor between Lake Placid and Tupper Lake, an effort that we did that both the Preservation League and Historic Saranac Lake were part of. So there are a lot of losses along the way. Another one of our core pillars of our work is providing technical services, and sometimes these are kind of obvious things, helping the developer of this a project to convert a school building in Willsboro into an assisted living facility using the state and federal preservation tax credits. In Old Forge, we helped to inspire a community organization to move a little rustic cottage that was going to be demolished onto the shores of Fourth Lake to create a visitors center there. We've worked for years with the wonderful women that are central to the preservation and use of Temple Beth Joseph and Tupper Lake in a whole number of ways. As this work with them goes over about 20 years. And I think we take even particular pride in working in communities that have the least amount going for them in terms of architecture, in terms of resources, in terms of wealth. And so in Corinth here on the Hudson, we've worked very closely with this community to save the little schoolhouse that's on the left and create a museum in the former International Paper Headquarters building on the second slide from the left. We've provided assistance to a wonderful farm in Thurman called Meadow Farm to find a contractor to rehabilitate their wonderful cathedral-esque barn. There was a group of people in Jay who wanted to turn the former land of make-believe property into a public park, and thanks to funding from NISCA, we were able to get through a conceptual design stage there before Hurricane Irene washed away absolutely everything there. Another little kind of oddity, this is a gazebo or a summer house in Champlain, New York, the preservation of which was done by a single individual who really just simply needed some hand-holding to get through this process. This is now in the grounds of a wonderful, picturesque cemetery there. And we were delighted to be involved in the preservation of a little building called the Closet on the grounds of the Sembrick, sorry, I'm forgetting the name of this Siegel Music Colony, that it housed a young man who was an African-American man who was a student there. And it's a building that tells an uncomfortable story that even in the 1950s and 60s, that people of color were treated differently when they came to the Adirondacks. And so happily, this building was saved. It was moved to and is on permanent display at the Adirondack Experience. And it tells the story of Fulton Friar there. And we were proud to be part of that. We also do a lot of National Register work in the region, including a thematic nomination for fire towers, a thematic nomination for 17 historic bridges over the Otsego River, the Whiteface Veterans Memorial Highway built in the late 20s and early 30s, the fairgrounds in Essex County Fairgrounds in Westport, New York. The building on the bottom right is currently one of our advocacy projects to save this from a demolition plan by Essex County. Getting this property on the National Register was part of the strategy for making sure that these fairgrounds are well cared for and appreciated. Other National Register work, a church on Racket Lake built by William West Durant. And one of the National Register projects I'm proudest of is this little district in Crown Point, which is probably the community in the Adirondacks that had the deepest hostility to land use planning and anything that smacked of regulation. And here, just going back to the context for our work, and here we were able to convince with some enthusiasm that this community had a really wonderful cluster of historic buildings around its green, now listed. We also give out awards every year to recognize exemplary preservation work. Some of it is obvious, like the longtime stewardship of the courthouse in Lake George. This building was converted into a local museum and a stop on a tourist train in North Creek. But we love the odd stuff too, the way that this business took a really pretty ordinary concrete block garage and adaptively reused it into a really first-class wooden boat restoration business. And lastly, we also own our own historic property on the Otsego River in Keysville, where we have our offices. We also own a fabulous 1849 stone mill along the river that we are about to put into the hands of a couple who will, I think, develop it in a really way that benefits this community. So I thank you for all of your attention to all of that. I'm trying to turn this off.
Wonderful. Stephen, thank you so much. And if Amy and Howard, you would both come back on, we can have a conversation. Those were really wonderful presentations. Thank you so much. All three of you have done such extraordinary work over such a long period of time. And you know, I'm always thinking about preservation and about the work of you three in particular, and it's very like the Adirondack Experience, the Museum on Blue Mountain Lake. We are all of these organizations are at their very core educational institutions. That's the whole point. We believe in the value that if you teach people about places, if you tell stories through the resources that are there, the more somebody knows about their place, the better steward they will be. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all working towards, is all of us are better stewards of this extraordinary region in New York. And we all understand, and your work recognizes that no community can be revitalized successfully without preservation. It is part of the mix, it's part of the toolkit, and it's really simple. And the work you all have done over so many years is such an extraordinary model. So I had a technical question that was posed by one of our listeners. And Amy, this one's for you, and you could pass it off to a lawyer if you want, but it was an excellent question from someone who wants to know, how does a nonprofit take advantage of the tax credit? I think most people understand that it's really designed for commercial use, commercially.
Yep. Well, I'll do my best to answer it, not being a lawyer. The minute we got really interested in this, we definitely made sure we had some lawyers on our team. As a nonprofit, we are not able to make use of the tax credits because we don't have a tax burden, obviously, but there is a mechanism where a nonprofit can form an LLC that allows you to sell the credits to a for-profit. And it looks pretty complex on paper, it's the kind of thing that if a lawyer doesn't know about it, they might sort of say, no, can't do it. And I would urge you to not listen to that lawyer and go talk to somebody who has experience with it. There are quite a few examples of nonprofits that have been successful with this around the country. And we actually are working with a consultant in Virginia who has worked with a number of nonprofit projects in New York, but around the country as well to, put together you really need to have an accountant and a lawyer and you need a professional team that can walk you through it, but it is possible.
Right, and I think, as I recall, one of the first, probably the first use of that tax credit for a nonprofit in New York State was Dia Beacon, when they converted that Nabisco box factory in Beacon, New York on the Hudson River into their gallery space. Just something we're thinking, that was a while ago, but it is absolutely a mechanism that exists. It's been around for a while. It's legit, but you definitely need to have professionals around the table who understand it.
Yeah.
So another question from our listeners here. How does, Steven, this one's for you. How does Steven cover all the area physically, which is vast? How much staff do you have?
So we have a full-time staff of 4. And the way we cover the region is we're driving around a lot. I mean, that's just the nature of the work. And even though we're located currently up in the northeast corner of the park, we make a real commitment to being available and accessible to everybody. And so if we get a call from someone in Old Forge or Northville, we find a way to get there. And we also try to do our tours and lectures and everything we try to spread out, have happening in as big a part of the region as possible.
And how many staff do you have now?
Oh, sorry, full-time staff of 4.
All right, so this falls under the heading of, this is how preservation works. Small footprint, big impact. It's true for pretty much every nonprofit preservation group I've ever known. So here's another one from a colleague of mine who I know does not spend a lot of time in the Adirondacks, and he doesn't understand the depth of and the quality of the architecture we have, but this is for all of you. Maybe you could all comment. How has the general tourism public responded to your efforts to preserve, quote, ordinary buildings, as opposed to great camps, which get most of the attention regarding what's worth seeing in the Adirondacks?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that, a lot of people who are visitors here are seeking out, the great camps. I mean, that's a big attraction. But I think, the Adirondacks has so many wonderful little communities, and the simple act of arriving in Westport or Port Henry or Northville and just using your feet to get around and explore these, very intact, lovely little communities is always, I think, eye-opening. So, I don't know if that maybe doesn't get to it, but.
Yeah, I would say something similar, that while the great camps have the sex appeal and the renown that goes beyond the blue line, when people get here, they spend time in the hamlets and in the villages. And so walking around Saranac Lake is part of the tourist experience, and part of it's for shopping, but part of it's for just enjoying the historic ambiance. And we have quite a few, 20, 30, 40 villages and hamlets, main streets that really are part of the Adirondack experience.
Amy, do you have a thought or two?
Quick thought, I guess, would be that I think it's all about telling the stories connected with the buildings. And so once you can add the human stories that go with whatever the building is, whether it's a big, sexy, great camp or a little humble cure cottage, if you can humanize that place, then that's how people connect with that place. And so the more we can connect our built environment to the people that lived there, the more it becomes a living, vibrant place for the people that are visiting.
Right, and I think people are really beginning to get it, particularly, you know, in this last summer with a huge increase of tourism to the region. I think there are a lot of people discovering that this is a pretty extraordinary place, and there's a lot more to it than just great camps. So one other question, again, for any or all of you, what advice do you give to young preservationists who are building on your examples? Stephen, maybe you could talk about the internship program you all have at Santinoni and what kind of advice you have to those folks, because a lot of the people who've been interns at Santinoni have gone off and stayed in the preservation field and have gone off and done wonderful things. So what advice do you give them?
Yeah, so Anne's referring to the fact that, you know, for the last 20 plus years, we have managed Camp Santinoni in partnership with New York State DEC and the town of Newcomb. And for almost 30 years, we've had a summer staff there, and they're primarily recruited from history and historic preservation programs. And I think it's a great opportunity for them to see, you know, the variety of ways that people with a preservation education can work in the world. It's one of the things I love about a preservation degree is it sort of sets you up for doing a whole lot of different things. You could work in the museum field, you can work for nonprofits, you can work for state agencies, you can work for, you know, private consultants like architects, and there's a lot of opportunities that people have. So lots of things are possible with that kind of interest and training.
Right. Howie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Not really. I think Steven summarized it well.
Can I just say, I mean, I think one of the things that's changing in our field is that we're starting to think less of historic preservation as something by itself,
Right.
Isolated from other things. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time, but the public is just starting to catch up with us. And I think that, I often tell people that, for instance, in the Champlain Valley where we're based, there's a whole plethora of kind of young farmers that have come here to sort of take up, you know, niche farming, and they're reusing farmhouses and historic barns and bringing lands and soil and buildings, you know, back to life. And I say to them, you know, you're historic preservationists, whether you realize it or not. And the people that open up a brewery in Crown Point in the old Agway building, he thinks of himself as a businessman, but he's also a historic preservationist. And so I think that's where the field is going. It's becoming just, and it should continue to go. It's just way more entwined with lots of other things, and it's becoming a little less visible as an independent thing, which is, I think, good.
Right, absolutely. So another question came in. Stephen, you mentioned the work of a previously enslaved person who was a builder. And how did you learn about that person, and where are the resources to do that kind of research? I know Sally Svensson published a book fairly recently titled, I believe, The Black Experience in the Adirondacks. So there is research on this, but do you think there's a lot of work by African-American builders in the region, or is this unusual, what you found?
I suspect it's pretty unusual, but who knows? You know, I mean, I think there's this you know, all of a sudden there's this explosion of interest in looking at others, at the stories of others, the stories of people that have been ignored by history and by historians. And I think that story of Isaac Johnson came to us in through a Facebook post, and it led us down this wonderful rabbit hole of sorts. And it happened that our educational program director, Nolan Kuhl, was trained in public history. And so once he got on the scent that this was an interesting story, one that wasn't widely known, he has spent several years just on that track. And that, and it's a lot of time, but it's a very important story, and it's important to us to be telling those stories. And so we try to give Nolan and all of us the kind of leeway I said earlier about how important keeping curious is. And I think allowing people, the staff's curiosity to run, not amok, but to run out is important.
Yeah, it's important and really interesting, because there is an effort across the region, I think, to focus on issues of diversity, to understand and to get different kinds of people up to the region. And I'll just mention that the Adirondack Experience has launched something called the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. And we're doing that in partnership with several organizations around the region. And we're doing focus groups. We have been doing a series of webinars, one called Driving While Black. It's a really interesting conversation. And again, your staff person's work on that architect or that builder, and also, the Fulton Fryer project, beginning to tell those stories is really important. I think we all understand that. So let me ask you, all of you, if we could pivot just a tiny bit and think about the future. So we've talked about what you all have done. We've talked about what's happening now. What do you think is coming up in the future for preservation? Do you see the need for working more for work at the state level to tweak policy? Do you see the field continuing to evolve? Steven, you began to touch on that. Do you see the kinds of things we engage in evolving? Give us your thoughts.
Well, I can tell you that in our advocacy work, the biggest problems we have are butting up against state agencies and county governments. And in the case of state agencies, it's around the preservation of places like DeBar Pond Lodge or the Gooley Club or Fire Towers or Santinoni or Camp Intermission. There's the Valcourt Islands. There's a list that's quite long where what we see as an apparent conflict between the forest preserve and cultural resources just seems to be still hard to solve. And so, for us, I think we'd like to see a greater, clarity in state policy around cultural resources that exist in the forest preserve. And, we're talking about a very finite number of places. This isn't a slippery slope. It's just simply acknowledging that they exist, that they have public value, that they are valued by the public, and we should make it easier for their preservation and state ownership. And with county governments, we're in a fight right now with Essex County around the preservation of some really extraordinarily rare historic bridges on the Osable River, and the counties just simply don't see that that's part of their responsibility is to be stewards of historic bridges, even though the public is wildly enthusiastic about them, even though some of them are not just on the National Register, but are listed as National Historic Civil Engineering Landmarks. So governments are not catching up. The public's attitude about these things is way ahead of where governments are. And so we'd love to see enlightenment, happen a little quicker.
Yeah. Howie, what do you say?
Yeah. I think all of the above is part of the answer to your question, Ann, of what we're going to need to do in the future. I think all the things that Amy and Steven listed as the accomplishments of historic Saranac Lake and Arch are going to have to continue. Sometimes it's finding a use for an endangered property like a museum or as an art center, and that's the solution. Sometimes it's educating a town board. Sometimes it's working with a state agency. Sometimes it's advocating for a single property, which when it reaches the demolition stage, that's what's happened with DeBar Pond Lodge. Arch had been working on this for 10 years or more like 15 years, making progress, getting it listed on the National Register, trying to come up with solutions, but not much was happening. And finally, the state last year said, we want to tear down the lodge and make a campground there or a day use area there. And that put us into high gear. We formed, by the way, originally Katie had the title of the program, there was a picture of DeBar Pond Lodge, this huge 10, 12 bedroom log face structure that's on the National Register, which would make a wonderful site for people to stay and enjoy and to learn. And we put together a coalition this last winter of local governments at all levels in the park, economic development groups, historic preservation groups, including Historic Saranac Lake and the Preservation League and Arch. We created a new nonprofit organization called the DeBar Pond Institute, and that institute and Arch have been the champions of this new proposed land exchange amendment, where we'll hopefully receive 6 acres and the endangered buildings at DeBar, and in return trade the state 400 or more acres for the forest preserve. And we're going through all the steps that we went through back at the Sagamore stage over 40 years ago. We're going through it again. We're halfway through the state legislature now, and hope to get the first passage this coming spring in the state legislature. And so when you say, how do you see the future? I'll be busy with that into my 80s.
So it sounds like we can't rest on our laurels. There's still lots to do.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, gives meaning to life.
That's right. So are there any other questions or any other, anything we missed? I don't see any other questions from our viewers. Amy, did you want to speak to any of these? Did you want to speak to the future a little bit? Because you're coming at it from a local, what would be useful for historic Saranac Lake at this point?
Well, money's always helpful, in the end, right? I guess it's just interesting to think about, there's so many people, talking with Mary, I mentioned in my little presentation, sitting down and talking with Mary about the founding of HSL, there are a lot of names that go way back that have laid the groundwork for what we're doing today. But there are always a few people that do most of the work. And that's Mary for many, many years, Steven for many, many years, Howie. There are a few people that do a lot, and then there's a lot of people that support those efforts. And so I think it's, this isn't some work that Historic Saranac Lake is very involved with. I think Arch this is more in your wheelhouse. But developing those leaders in preservation is so important. It's, I think we've all been worried about Steven retiring, and it's so exciting that somebody is filling your shoes, Steven, or at least going to try to. I don't know how your shoes can be filled. So, finding ways to support those people who are going to take over the leadership positions and stay there, because that it's through those long years of building those relationships that things get done. Get really done. Somebody has to stay in that job for a long time, and that's when the real hard work gets done. So. Right.
There's, Stephen talked a little bit about the diversity and inclusion issue, as did I. Amy, Howie, do you have anything to add to that? Can you expand a little bit more? What, if anything, you're doing to tell broader stories?
Yeah, well, I think for us with the museum expansion, it gives us more space to do that, and we're excited about that. That's a real important part of our plan for the new space. We recognize that we have failed to describe or interpret the history of Native Americans in the region. There's been a real sort of, failure to describe how the importance of the region to Native American peoples for thousands of years. And we tended to sort of just gloss over that and say, oh, Native American people came here seasonally, they passed through. Let's talk about history when the white people came. And so we intend to do a better job of that. Although I think what we also want to do is point people to the Six Nations Museum, which is a wonderful cultural center near us that does that job. So that is an example. I mean, for me personally, what got me interested in Saranac Lake history, I was actually a Spanish teacher years ago. And I researched the Spanish-speaking population that was here in Saranac Lake. There were thousands of people from all over Latin America here for the fresh air cure. So that was the way that I connected with our local and eventually changed jobs. So that's an incredibly rich history that could be explored and told more fully. And I found myself, I mean, this is just sort of a random story, but we just opened a new exhibit called Pandemic Perspectives that's making connections between the COVID pandemic and tuberculosis. We featured a nurse on a present day nurse and a historic nurse on our main panel banner. And I didn't realize, I didn't know the nurse that we featured, we had her permission, but in the course of opening the exhibit, I got to meet her, and she's from Cuba. And so I found myself about a week ago having these fabulous conversations with my new friend, Sarah Diaz, who is our nurse and our new famous nurse on the outside of our building, and talking with her about the Spanish-speaking patients that were here. So I think in the process of telling our history, we make connections to people in the present day, and that's just such an important part of things at the museum.
That's a lovely story. That's great. That's great.
At the Bar Pond Institute, one of our board members is Nikki Hilton Patterson, who is the executive director of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. And you might wonder, well, what motivated her to want to be involved in on the ground floor in preserving this Adirondack Great Camp that itself, from what we know, didn't have much involvement by people of color or other minorities. But she sees the potential for a DeBar Lodge to bring people from diverse backgrounds and urban backgrounds up to the Adirondacks to have a wonderful experience of learning and living in the outdoors, close to the outdoors, but connected to a long history. And so she hopes that if we succeed with the Land Exchange Amendment to save DeBar, that her programming will become a major feature of programming at DeBar, and that it would also be a wonderful place for workshops and conferences, or bring people of diverse backgrounds together to continue to talk about how we can have a more diverse climate and acceptance in the Adirondacks.
That's a wonderful, I was going to ask you about the future, thinking about future programming at that space. That's terrific. Howie, I'm going to connect you to a new board member on the Adirondack Experiences board, Benita Law Diallo, who's fabulous, and she's very interested, she's from Albany, very interested in this topic. I will make that introduction.
Great.
Great. One last question. I'll read this. Let's see. It just popped in. Malone has recently been listed for our Main Street, and we are now doing the research for our 330 residential buildings. What other activities can our organization do to build education? Do you have a list of local authors that we could host on Meet the Author Nights? So that's coming in from somebody in Malone. So any advice for doing research?
We've been working for the last couple of years with Mary Scharf, who asked this question, and we're currently doing the field work for this big residential National Register nomination that Malone Revitalization is spearheading. And we are just, I can't tell you how delighted we are that Malone has sort of realized that, you know, historic preservation and using some of the financial incentives that come with it can be a big part of its economic revitalization. But Mary's right, is that there's lots of opportunities to be doing talks and tours and workshops and publications, and to build on, you know, think of the National Register where it's just a foundation for lots of things to follow. And we look forward to working with the folks up there and making that happen.
Do you have authors? Can anybody suggest an author for local authors who you could suggest for folks in Malone to be reading?
I was just last evening at Haas's General Store, has an author's night every year for the last 40 plus years. And I was at author's night at Haas's General Store. And not only do I periodically do talks on my experiences with Great Camp Sagamore and Uncas and White Pine and Santinoni and now DeBar, but there are a good number of authors there who have written about the history of the Adirondacks, and I can send Mary a copy of the flyer with some of the names on it, and we'll be happy to think with you about possible authors to come to speak. That's another thing that's unique about DeBar Pond Lodge. It's in the very northern part of the Adirondacks, a very underutilized area, but it's only 20 miles from Malone, a major resource. So we hope that, and we've gotten letters of support from the Malone Downtown Revitalization Commission and the Chamber of Commerce, thanks to Mary, in support of saving DeBar, because Malone and DeBar go really well together, just a short distance from the city into the mountains of the Adirondacks. There's such a great resource available to them.
And Howie, that was at Haas's General Store in Long Lake, where you
Yes.
did.
Yes.
Excellent. They are the center of the universe. So,
hey everyone, I am popping back up because we're right about at time, but I want to give all of you kind of last chance to leave us with your final thoughts, anything that you think could be a takeaway for people working not just in the Adirondacks but statewide, because I do think that the Adirondack region is so interesting and there's so many lessons to be learned from how preservation has worked in the Adirondack region, especially in terms of conservation and sustainability, which is something that we're all thinking a lot more about these days. So any final thoughts? We'll start with Steven.
Final thoughts. Well, I've been thinking about, I mentioned very briefly that we own a historic mill property behind our offices, and we've been trying for years to bring it, to get it developed, first by ourselves and now with others. And one of the things that we saw was an impediment to the development of this property was that there was an adjoining property with a collapsing building on it that just was sort of turning people off. And we realized we had to do something about that too. And so we bought the property, demolished the building, and we've raised, I don't know, $600,000 to build a new public waterfront park that will adjoin our stone mill. Well, you know, we're not in the park building business, but we are in the business of community revitalization. And sometimes you look around and nobody else is stepping forward to do it, and you realize it's us, you know, so you just forge ahead and do it. And the results will be, I think, you know, really extraordinary. I'm of course very glad we did. So get out of your comfort zone a little bit, and if you can afford to, and great things can happen.
I just want to say here to Steven, who, as you heard, will be retiring at the end of this year, and will be having his a gala, the Arch Gala next weekend, celebrating Steven's 27 years and more with Arch. And it's been an absolute joy to work with him all over every one of those years. And the Adirondacks will miss him in this one capacity, but we're happy to have him remain as an Adirondacker and who will be involved in many ways that are yet to be determined.
And it's hard to follow that. I totally agree. Steven, you've made such a huge difference for me personally, professionally, for the region. And whenever I hear you speak, I think, how does he do that? You just are so eloquent and so thoughtful, and you somehow manage to do so much without seeming rushed. So that's a magical quality that you have, and we're happy to see you moving on to do just what you love, and maybe not some of all the work that was making you feel rushed behind the scenes. So
thank you both.
Well, this has been a really wonderful panel. Thank you all so much. And Steven, Wes and I are very much looking forward to seeing you on Saturday, and we're now calling Steven Fest. I hope we have I'm sure there will be lots of people celebrating you. But thank you all, and thank you, Katie, for orchestrating a really wonderful hour and a half. Thanks.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you for your time and your expertise, for the work that you do, and thank you all for joining us. We have lots more great programming on the docket always, so you can check our website, check our social media. The League is a nonprofit, so thank you to our members and supporters. You all make the work we do possible, and so do you, all of our panelists. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you all at another event someday. Have a great day.
Thank you.